I was standing in my greenhouse on a Tuesday morning in January when I heard the unmistakable sound of heels clicking against the concrete path outside. And I knew immediately that Susan Hartwell from the HOA was coming to ruin my day. The greenhouse had been my retirement project after leaving my job as an aerospace engineer in Seattle. My wife Gina and I had moved to Henderson, Nevada, seeking warmer weather and a quieter life. The greenhouse was something I had been dreaming about for years, a place where I could grow vegetables year-round and maybe even some exotic orchids. I had spent months designing it, getting all the proper permits from Clark County, and building it exactly to specifications. It was 16 feet by 20 feet, positioned in the back corner of our half-acre lot, far enough from the property lines to satisfy every zoning requirement imaginable. The heater was the newest addition. Nevada might be in the desert, but winter nights could drop below freezing, and I needed to protect my plants. I had installed a commercial-grade propane heater with proper ventilation, exhaust systems, and every safety feature required by code. The whole setup had cost me nearly $4,000, but it was worth it to see my tomatoes thriving in January while everyone else was buying tasteless supermarket produce. Susan stopped at the greenhouse door, her perfectly coiffed blonde hair not moving an inch despite the mild breeze. She was wearing what I had come to think of as her uniform, a cream-colored pantsuit that probably cost more than my heater, pearl earrings, and an expression that suggested she had just discovered someone had committed a heinous crime against humanity. "Warren Garrison," she said, not even bothering with a greeting. "I need to speak with you about that monstrosity." She was pointing at my heater, which was humming quietly in the corner, doing exactly what it was supposed to do. "Good morning, Susan," I said, trying to maintain some semblance of civility. "The heater, it's completely up to code. I had it professionally installed 3 weeks ago." "I don't care what you think is up to code," she snapped. "Several residents have complained about the noise, the smell, and the unsightly appearance of that industrial equipment. This is a residential neighborhood, not a factory." I took a deep breath. The heater was barely audible from outside the greenhouse, and there was no smell because it was properly vented. As for unsightly, it was inside my greenhouse, which itself was tucked away in the back of my property. You could barely see it from the street. "Susan, I followed every regulation. I got the permits from the county. Everything is documented and approved." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Your permits don't override our HOA covenants." Section 12, Paragraph 4 states that no industrial equipment may be installed on any property within Rolling Hills Estates without prior approval from the Architectural Review Committee. "It's not industrial equipment. It's a greenhouse heater." "That's your interpretation," she said. "I'm giving you official notice that you need to remove it within 10 days, or the HOA will pursue legal action. Additionally, I'll be reporting this to the county zoning department. I'm quite certain they'll agree that this violates residential zoning codes." She turned on her heel and walked away before I could respond, leaving me standing there with my jaw clenched and my blood pressure rising. Gina had warned me about Susan when we moved in 2 years ago. The previous owner had mentioned that Susan had been HOA president for 5 years and treated the position like she was running a small dictatorship. But this was the first time she had come after me directly. I went inside and found Gina in the kitchen, working on her laptop. She was a freelance graphic designer and worked from home most days. When I told her what happened, she closed her laptop and sighed. "I knew this was coming," she said. "Remember what happened to the Mitchells 3 houses down? Susan made them remove their solar panels because she said they were too reflective and created a glare. But solar panels are legal. More than legal, they're encouraged. She doesn't care about legal. She cares about control. Gina stood up and poured herself more coffee. What are you going to do? I'm not removing the heater. I did everything right. I'm going to fight this. Over the next 2 days, I pulled together all my documentation. I had the building permits from Clark County showing approval for the greenhouse construction. I had the mechanical permit for the heater installation. I had the inspection reports from the licensed contractor who installed it, confirming everything met National Fire Protection Association standards and local codes. I had photos showing the heater's position, the ventilation system, and the setbacks from property lines. I even had a sound level reading I had taken with a decibel meter, showing the heater produced less noise than a normal conversation. On Thursday, I drove to the Clark County Building Department in downtown Henderson. The office was busy with contractors and homeowners dealing with various permit issues. I waited 45 minutes before I could speak with someone at the counter. The clerk, a middle-aged woman named Patricia according to her name tag, listened to my situation and pulled up my permits on her computer. "Everything looks in order," she said. "Your greenhouse was permitted and inspected. The heater installation was permitted and inspected. Both passed. Is there a specific code violation someone is claiming? The HOA president says it violates residential zoning because it's industrial equipment." Patricia frowned and typed something else. "Let me check the zoning code for your address." She read through something on her screen, then shook her head. "No, you're fine. Greenhouse heaters are specifically allowed as accessory equipment for residential agricultural use, and your property is zoned R1, which permits greenhouse structures and associated equipment. The HOA can't override county zoning codes." That's what I thought, but she said she's going to report it to zoning anyway. Well, if she does, an inspector will come out. But honestly, based on what I'm seeing in your file, they'll approve it. You've done everything correctly. She printed out copies of my permits and the relevant zoning codes. "Keep these with you. If the HOA continues to harass you, you might want to consider getting a lawyer." I left feeling somewhat vindicated but also frustrated that it had come to this. When I got home, there was a formal letter from the HOA in my mailbox. It was printed on official Rolling Hills Estates letterhead and signed by Susan in her capacity as HOA president. The letter reiterated her demand that I remove the heater within 10 days and added that the HOA would assess daily fines of $100 for each day of non-compliance after the deadline. Gina read the letter and shook her head. "This is ridiculous. $100 a day. That's extortion." "It's a scare tactic," I said, though I felt a knot of worry forming in my stomach. We had paid off our house before moving to Nevada, but we were living on retirement savings and Gina's freelance income. We couldn't afford to throw away money on HOA fines, even if they were unjust. That evening, I went through the HOA covenants with a fine-toothed comb. Section 12. Paragraph 4 did indeed mention industrial equipment, but the language was vague. It talked about equipment that created noise, odors, or visual blight. My heater did none of those things. I also found a provision stating that the HOA couldn't enforce regulations that conflicted with local, state, or federal law. Since my heater complied with all county codes, I believed I had a solid argument. Friday morning, I decided to reach out to my neighbors. If Susan claimed multiple people had complained, I wanted to know who and why. I started with Jim and Martha Perkins, who lived directly behind us. Jim was retired military and Martha was a school teacher. They were practical people who kept to themselves. Jim answered the door and invited me in for coffee. When I explained the situation, he looked confused. complaints about noise. Warren, I've never heard your heater. I didn't even know you had one until you just told me. He looked at Martha, who shook her head. We've never complained to the HOA about anything from your property, Martha said. Your greenhouse is lovely. I wish we had the space for one. I visited 3 more neighbors whose properties were closest to mine. None of them had any complaints. None of them had even noticed the heater. 2 of them mentioned that Susan had recently increased HOA dues and was pushing for more restrictive covenants, which had annoyed several residents. By Friday afternoon, I was convinced that Susan had fabricated the complaints. That made me angry enough to do something I normally wouldn't do. I decided to attend the next HOA board meeting, which according to the community website was scheduled for the following Tuesday evening. The weekend passed tensely. Gina and I tried to relax, but the situation with the HOA hung over us like a dark cloud. On Sunday, I spent several hours in the greenhouse, tending to my plants and trying to find some peace in the work. The tomatoes were setting fruit beautifully. The lettuce was crisp and perfect. The orchids I had been nursing along were finally showing signs of blooming. All of this would be at risk if I had to remove the heater. Monday morning, I received a phone call from the Clark County Zoning Department. The caller identified herself as Michelle Torres, a code enforcement inspector. Mr. Garrison, I'm calling about a complaint we received regarding unpermitted construction at your residence. Specifically, a report that you've installed industrial heating equipment in violation of residential zoning codes. My heart sank. Susan had actually followed through on her threat. I have all the permits for my greenhouse and heater, I said. I can provide documentation. That's fine, but I still need to conduct an inspection. It's standard procedure when we receive a complaint. Are you available tomorrow morning around 10? Yes, I'll be here. Perfect. I'll see you then, Mr. Garrison. I spent the rest of Monday gathering all my documentation again and making sure the greenhouse was immaculate. I also printed out photos showing the heater installation from multiple angles, highlighting the safety features and ventilation systems. Tuesday morning arrived cold and clear. I was up early, too anxious to sleep much. Gina made breakfast, but I barely touched it. At 9:45, I was already outside, waiting by the greenhouse when a white county vehicle pulled up. Michelle Torres was a woman in her 30s with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. She wore a county ID badge and carried a clipboard and camera. She greeted me professionally and asked to see the greenhouse. I showed her everything. The permits, the inspection records, the contractor's certifications, the manufacturer's specifications for the heater. She spent nearly an hour examining the installation, taking photos, checking measurements, and consulting a thick binder of code regulations she had brought with her. Finally, she straightened up and turned to me. Mr. Garrison, I want to be clear about something. Everything here is completely up to code. Your permits are valid, your installation is professional and safe, and there's absolutely nothing that violates residential zoning. This heater is actually nicer and safer than many I've seen in commercial operations. Relief washed over me. So I don't have to remove it? Absolutely not. In fact, I'm going to document this inspection as approved and compliant. She paused, then continued. I also need to tell you that filing a false complaint with the zoning department is a violation of county ordinance. The complaint we received claimed you had unpermitted industrial equipment, creating safety hazards and code violations. None of that is true. Whoever filed this complaint either didn't know what they were talking about, or they deliberately misrepresented the facts. It was my HOA president, Susan Hartwell. Michelle nodded slowly. I'm going to need to speak with her. Do you have contact information? I provided Susan's phone number and email from the HOA directory. Michelle wrote everything down carefully. Mr. Garrison, I'm going to issue a formal citation to Ms. Hartwell for filing a false report. It's a civil infraction with a fine of $500. If she continues to file false reports, the penalties increase significantly, and it can become a criminal matter. I'll also be sending a letter to your HOA confirming that your installation is compliant with all codes and that they have no grounds for action based on zoning violations. Thank you, I said, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. I appreciate you taking the time to do this thoroughly. It's my job. And honestly, it's frustrating when people abuse the complaint system for personal disputes. It wastes county resources and creates unnecessary stress for property owners like yourself. She handed me a copy of her inspection report, marked with a large green approved stamp. Keep this with your records. If the HOA gives you any more trouble about zoning issues, refer them to me. After Michelle left, I went inside to tell Gina. She hugged me tightly, relief evident on her face. I'm so glad that's over, she said. It's not over yet, I replied. The HOA meeting is tonight. I'm going to that. The HOA meeting was held at the community center, a small building near the neighborhood entrance. When Gina and I arrived at 7, about 20 people were already there, sitting in folding chairs arranged in rows facing a table at the front. Susan sat at the center of the table with 4 other board members, 2 men and 2 women I recognized from around the neighborhood but didn't know personally. Susan's expression tightened when she saw me walk in, but she didn't say anything. Gina and I took seats near the back. The meeting started with standard business. Approval of previous meeting minutes. A financial report showing the HOA had over $200,000 in reserves, and discussion about hiring a new landscaping company. It was all mind-numbingly boring, and I could see several people checking their phones or staring off into space. Finally, after 45 minutes, Susan opened the floor for new business and resident comments. I raised my hand. Warren Garrison. Susan acknowledged me with obvious reluctance. I stood up, holding the inspection report Michelle had given me. I want to address the complaint you filed about my greenhouse heater. That's not appropriate for this meeting, Susan interrupted. Personal disputes should be handled through proper channels. This isn't a personal dispute. You sent me an official HOA letter threatening fines. You filed a complaint with the county claiming I violated zoning codes. I think the community has a right to know what happened. Several people perked up, sensing drama. Susan looked uncomfortable. As I stated in my letter, your equipment violates HOA covenants, she said stiffly. Which covenant specifically? Section 12, paragraph 4, industrial equipment. A greenhouse heater isn't industrial equipment. It's standard agricultural equipment permitted under residential zoning. Today, a county inspector came to my property in response to your complaint. I held up the inspection report. She approved everything. The heater is completely compliant with all codes. In fact, she was so thorough that she spent an hour examining every aspect of the installation. The room had gone quiet. Everyone was listening now. Furthermore, I continued, the inspector informed me that she would be citing you for filing a false report with the zoning department. That's a $500 fine, Susan. You wasted county resources because you didn't like something on my property that's completely legal. Susan's face had gone red. That inspector doesn't understand HOA covenants. The inspector's letter to the HOA will confirm that my installation complies with all applicable laws. The HOA cannot enforce covenants that contradict county zoning codes. That's actually in our own covenants, Section 3, Paragraph 7. One of the other board members, a man named David Kimball spoke up. "Susan, did you actually file a complaint with the county?" "I reported a potential violation," Susan said defensively. "It's my responsibility as HOA president to ensure residents comply with community standards." "Did you inspect his property first?" David asked. "Did you verify there was actually a violation before involving the county?" "I received complaints from residents about noise and appearance." "That's not true," I said firmly. "I spoke with every neighbor whose property is near mine. None of them complained. None of them even noticed the heater. You fabricated those complaints to justify your actions." "That's slander." Susan snapped. "It's not slander if it's true, and I have signed statements from my neighbors confirming they made no complaints." I had actually gone back over the weekend and asked Jim, Martha, and the others to write brief statements. I pulled out the papers and held them up. The murmuring in the room grew louder. People were looking at Susan with expressions ranging from confusion to disapproval. Another board member, a woman named Teresa Chen, leaned over to whisper something to David. Susan stood up abruptly. "This meeting is getting out of hand. We need to move on to other business." "No," David said, also standing. "I think we need to discuss this. Susan, you've been increasingly aggressive with enforcement actions over the past year. 3 different residents have come to me privately complaining about harassment." This situation with Warren sounds like another example. "I'm enforcing the covenants we all agreed to," Susan said, her voice rising. "By filing false reports with the county," Teresa Chen said. "That's serious, Susan. That could expose the HOA to liability." "I think we need to call an emergency executive session," David said. "Susan, I'm moving that we temporarily suspend your enforcement authority pending a review of your actions as president." "You can't do that," Susan protested. "Actually, under the bylaws, the board can suspend any officer's authority with a majority vote if there's concern about misconduct," Teresa said. She was looking through a copy of the bylaws on her tablet. "David, I second your motion." The vote was 4-1, with only Susan voting against. The look on her face was a mixture of shock and rage. She gathered her papers and stormed out of the community center without another word. David turned to address the room. "I apologize that this meeting has been contentious. We'll investigate this situation thoroughly and report back to the community. In the meantime, if anyone has concerns about HOA enforcement actions, please contact me or Teresa directly." After the meeting ended, several people came up to talk to me. Most were supportive, thanking me for standing up to Susan. A few shared their own stories of what they felt were overly aggressive enforcement actions. One couple said Susan had threatened to fine them for having a basketball hoop in their driveway, claiming it was unsightly, even though several other houses in the neighborhood had the same thing. It was nearly 9:30 when Gina and I finally left. On the drive home, she reached over and squeezed my hand. "I'm proud of you," she said. "That took guts." "I'm just tired of bullies," I replied. "I did everything right, followed all the rules, and she came after me anyway because she could. That's not okay." Over the next few days, things got more interesting. On Wednesday, I received the official letter from Michelle Torres at the county, confirming my installation was compliant and noting that Susan Hartwell had been cited for filing a false report. The letter stated clearly that the HOA had no basis for enforcement action based on zoning or code violations. I made several copies of the letter. One went into my personal files, one got sent to David Kimball as the acting HOA president, and one I kept ready to produce if Susan tried anything else. On Thursday, I got a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, A woman introduced herself as Jennifer Kowalski, an attorney representing Susan Hartwell. "Mr. Garrison, my client believes that you defamed her character at the HOA meeting on Tuesday evening. She's considering legal action and wants to give you the opportunity to issue a public apology and retraction." I almost laughed. "Your client filed a false report with the county, threatened me with illegal fines, and fabricated complaints from neighbors. Everything I said at that meeting was true and documented. If she wants to sue me, she's welcome to try, but I'll countersue for harassment and abuse of her position." There was a pause. "Mr. Garrison, perhaps we should discuss this more calmly." "I am calm. I'm also being pushed around. Your client abused her authority as HOA president, wasted taxpayer resources, and tried to force me to remove legal equipment from my property. She got caught, and now she's facing consequences. If she continues to harass me, I'll file my own complaint with the county and pursue legal action against both her personally and the HOA. There's no need for threats. I'm not threatening. I'm stating facts. Have a good day, Miss Kowalski." I hung up. My hands were shaking slightly. I wasn't used to being confrontational like this, but I was angry. The audacity of Susan thinking she could intimidate me further after everything that had happened was infuriating. Gina had overheard the conversation from the kitchen. Susan hired a lawyer, apparently. She wanted me to apologize for defaming her at the meeting. That's insane. It's desperate. She knows she screwed up and she's trying to scare me into backing down. That evening, David Kimball called me. "Warren, I wanted to give you a heads up. The board met this afternoon in executive session to discuss Susan's actions. Based on the evidence, including the county letter and your neighbor statements, we've decided to remove her as president. We're also recommending that the membership vote to recall her from the board entirely at a special meeting next month." "That's a big step," I said. "It's necessary. We reviewed her enforcement actions over the past year, and there's a pattern of overreach and harassment. 3 other property owners have similar complaints. One family was threatened with fines because their kids' outdoor toys were visible from the street. Another was told to remove window shutters that Susan said were the wrong color, even though they matched dozens of other houses in the neighborhood. She's been abusing her position, and it needs to stop. What happens now with my situation? The HOA's position is that your greenhouse and heater are compliant with all applicable codes and covenants. You won't be receiving any fines or further enforcement actions. We're also going to review our covenant language to make sure it's clear and not subject to arbitrary interpretation." "I appreciate that, David. Thank you for taking this seriously. Thank you for bringing it to our attention. A lot of people have been unhappy with Susan's leadership, but nobody wanted to rock the boat. You forced the issue, and it needed to happen." The special meeting to vote on Susan's recall was scheduled for 3 weeks later. In the meantime, life slowly returned to normal. I spent my days in the greenhouse, enjoying the fruits of my labor. The heater continued to work perfectly, keeping my plants thriving despite nighttime temperatures dropping into the 30s. Susan made one more attempt to cause trouble. 2 weeks after the board meeting, I received a letter from her attorney threatening to sue me for defamation and emotional distress. The letter demanded $50,000 in damages and a public apology. I took the letter to my own attorney, a local lawyer named Robert Chen, who I had worked with when we bought our house. Robert read through the letter and shook his head. "This is nonsense," he said. "You have documentation for everything you said. Truth is an absolute defense against defamation. As for emotional distress, she'd have to prove that you intentionally inflicted severe emotional harm, which is a very high bar. This is a frivolous suit designed to intimidate you. What should I do? Let me respond. I'll make it clear that we have no intention of settling and that if she files suit, we'll countersue for malicious prosecution, abuse of process, and your legal fees. That should end this. Robert sent his letter, and I never heard from Susan's attorney again. Apparently, when faced with someone who wouldn't be bullied, Susan backed down. The recall meeting was held on a Wednesday evening at the community center. The turnout was huge, probably 60 or 70 people, more than I had ever seen at an HOA meeting. Gina and I arrived early and found seats near the middle. Susan was already there, sitting alone on one side of the room. She looked smaller somehow, less intimidating than she had that morning in my greenhouse. When the meeting started, David Kimball explained the recall process and the reasons the board was recommending Susan's removal. The board has documented numerous instances of enforcement overreach, harassment of residents, and abuse of presidential authority, David said. Most seriously, Miss Hartwell filed a false report with the county zoning department regarding Warren Garrison's property, resulting in a citation and fine from the county. This action put the HOA at risk of legal liability and damaged our relationship with county officials. Susan was given an opportunity to defend herself. She stood up and launched into a speech about how she had only been trying to maintain property values and enforce the covenants everyone had agreed to. She painted herself as a victim of ungrateful residents who didn't appreciate her hard work and dedication. It might have been more effective if half the room hadn't personally experienced her heavy-handed enforcement tactics. When she finished, several people raised their hands to speak. Jim Perkins, my neighbor, stood up. I've lived in this community for 8 years. Before Susan became president, the HOA handled problems with common sense and fairness. Under her leadership, it's become adversarial. She threatens people with fines over minor issues instead of working with them. That's not leadership. That's authoritarianism. Others shared similar experiences. The couple with the basketball hoop spoke about being threatened over their kids' toys. A retired teacher described being harassed about garden decorations that Susan personally didn't like. A young couple talked about being fined $300 because their lawn was 1/4 inch longer than the covenant allowed, even though they had been out of town for a family emergency. By the time the speaking portion ended, Susan's face was pale. The vote was conducted by secret ballot, and the result was overwhelming. 54 votes for recall, 8 against, with 3 abstentions. Susan was removed from the board effective immediately. She left the community center quickly without speaking to anyone. I actually felt a twinge of sympathy for her, despite everything. But then I remembered the stress she had caused me, the unnecessary conflict, and the way she had abused her position, and the sympathy faded. David caught up with me as Gina and I were leaving. Warren, the board would like to formally apologize for what you went through. We're going to be implementing new procedures to prevent this kind of thing from happening again. Enforcement actions will require review by at least 2 board members, and residents will have a clear appeal process before fines are assessed. That sounds like a good system, I said. I hope this makes the HOA more fair for everyone. That's the goal. And listen, we're going to need a new board member. Have you ever thought about serving? I laughed. I think I've had enough HOA drama for a lifetime, but I appreciate the offer. The final chapter of the saga came about a month later. I received a notice in the mail from Clark County Superior Court. Susan had been charged with additional code enforcement violations beyond just the false report about my property. Apparently, after Michelle Torres cited Susan for filing a false report on my greenhouse heater, The county had looked into other complaints Susan had filed over the past year. They discovered that Susan had filed at least 6 false or exaggerated reports against other property owners in our community and neighboring subdivisions. In some cases, she had filed complaints about properties that didn't even exist at the addresses she provided. The county took false reporting seriously because it wasted inspector time and resources that could be used for legitimate code enforcement. Susan was charged with multiple counts of filing false governmental reports, which in Nevada was a misdemeanor offense. According to the court notice, she had pled no contest to 3 counts in exchange for the others being dismissed. Her sentence included a $5,000 fine, 100 hours of community service, and probation for 1 year. If she filed any false reports during her probation, she could face jail time. I wasn't named in the criminal case, but I was listed as a witness in the court documents since my property had been one of the false reports. I never had to testify because of her plea deal, but the County Victim Services Office contacted me to let me know the outcome. This conviction will be on Miss Hartwell's permanent record, the victim advocate explained. If she ever tries to file complaints against you or anyone else in the future, this conviction will be taken into account. It basically ensures she can't abuse the code enforcement system anymore without facing serious consequences. After everything was resolved, I finally felt like I could breathe again. The greenhouse heater continued to work beautifully, and my winter garden was the best I had ever grown. The tomatoes alone saved us a fortune at the grocery store, not to mention the lettuce, peppers, and herbs that stayed productive all winter. The new HOA board was more reasonable and focused on actual community needs rather than petty enforcement. They organized neighborhood social events, negotiated better rates with service contractors, and implemented the new fair enforcement procedures David had promised. Several people who had been intimidated by Susan's reign started participating in HOA activities again. One Saturday morning in March, I was in the greenhouse transplanting some seedlings when Jim Perkins stopped by. He knocked on the door frame and asked if he could come in. "I've been thinking about building a greenhouse myself," he said, looking around admiringly. "Would you be willing to share some advice?" Of course. I learned a lot during this process, both about construction and about dealing with bureaucracy. We spent an hour talking about greenhouse design, permit requirements, and heating systems. Jim took notes and photos, asking detailed questions about everything from foundation materials to ventilation strategies. "I have to admit," Jim said as we finished up, "part of my motivation is knowing that you fought the battle and won. If Susan were still in charge, I would never attempt this because I wouldn't want the hassle. But knowing the HOA is being run more fairly now, I feel like I can actually use my property the way I want to." That conversation crystallized something for me. What had happened wasn't just about my greenhouse or my heater. It was about standing up against arbitrary authority and demanding fairness. Susan had created an environment of fear where people were afraid to use their own properties in legal ways because they didn't want to face her wrath. By refusing to back down and by documenting everything carefully, I had helped break that cycle. Over the following months, I noticed positive changes in the neighborhood. 3 more families built small greenhouses. Someone installed a beautiful pergola in their backyard without HOA interference. A retired veteran put up a flagpole that probably would have resulted in threats and fines under Susan's leadership, but the new board approved it without issue after confirming it met setback requirements. The community became friendlier and more relaxed. People stopped worrying that every little thing would result in nasty letters and fines. The HOA board focused on maintaining common areas and organizing community events, rather than playing enforcement officer. Gina and I celebrated our first full year in the house that April. We threw a small party and invited neighbors, including Jim and Martha, David Kimball and his wife, Teresa Chen, and several other people we had gotten to know through the whole ordeal. We served food made almost entirely from produce I had grown in the greenhouse. Fresh salads, roasted vegetables, and even some exotic herbs that impressed everyone. During the party, David raised his glass for a toast. To Warren, who reminded us that following the rules and standing up for what's right still matters, and to a better HOA that serves the community instead of trying to control it. Everyone drank to that, and I felt genuinely happy. The greenhouse had been worth every penny and every moment of stress, not just for the plants I could grow, but for the principle it represented. I had wanted a quiet retirement, but sometimes standing up for yourself and your neighbors is more important than avoiding conflict. In the end, the heater that caused so much trouble continued to hum quietly in the corner of my greenhouse, keeping my plants warm on cold desert nights. It was just a piece of equipment, but it had become a symbol of something larger. The right to use your property legally without harassment, and the importance of holding leaders accountable when they abuse their power. Susan never returned to the neighborhood. I heard through the grapevine that she sold her house and moved to Summerlin, a different part of Las Vegas. I didn't wish her ill, but I didn't miss her either. Some people are so focused on control that they forget about community, and she had been one of those people. The final twist came in June, almost 6 months after the original confrontation. I received a check in the mail from the HOA's insurance company for $1,200. Attached was a letter explaining that the board had filed a claim for the legal expenses I had incurred defending myself against Susan's false accusations. The insurance company had paid the claim and was seeking reimbursement from Susan personally under a provision in the HOA bylaws that held officers personally liable for damages caused by willful misconduct. I hadn't asked for the money and hadn't expected it, but it was a nice validation. It officially closed the books on the whole incident. I deposited the check and used part of it to buy some new orchids I had been wanting, rare species from Southeast Asia that required careful temperature control. The heater that had caused so much trouble would help me grow something beautiful. On a warm evening in late June, I was sitting in the greenhouse with a cold beer, just enjoying the peace and the sight of healthy plants growing in neat rows. Gina came out and sat beside me on the bench I had built along one wall. "You know what the best part of all this is?" she asked. "What's that?" "You turned a negative situation into something positive. Susan tried to bully you, and instead of just giving in or just fighting back, you stood up for yourself the right way. You documented everything, followed the proper procedures, and stayed calm even when she escalated. That's character. I just did what seemed right, exactly, and that's what made the difference." She leaned her head on my shoulder. "I'm proud of you, Warren Garrison. You're a good man." We sat there as the sun set, the heater's gentle hum barely audible over the sound of the evening breeze. The greenhouse smelled like earth and green growing things, a smell that represented life and potential and the future. All the stress and conflict seemed far away now, replaced by the simple satisfaction of plants thriving under careful attention. I thought about everything that had happened, from that first morning when Susan had appeared outside the greenhouse door to the final resolution at the recall meeting. It had been stressful and occasionally frightening, but I had learned some valuable lessons. I had learned that documentation is your best defense against false accusations. I had learned that most people are reasonable if you give them accurate information. I had learned that bullies often back down when confronted with the truth. And I had learned that standing up for yourself can inspire others to do the same. The neighborhood had changed for the better because one person refused to be intimidated. That person happened to be me, but it could have been anyone. The important thing was that someone finally said no to arbitrary enforcement and demanded fairness. Once that door opened, others walked through it. As summer deepened and temperatures in Henderson soared past 100 degrees, the greenhouse heater sat idle during the day. But at night, even in summer, the desert could be surprisingly cool, and occasionally I would hear it click on for an hour or two to maintain the optimal temperature for my more delicate plants. Each time I heard that sound, I felt a small sense of satisfaction. It was working exactly as designed, doing exactly what I had built it to do, and nobody was going to tell me I couldn't have it. The legal system had worked. The inspection process had worked. The HOA board, once the bad actor was removed, had worked. It restored my faith that institutions could function properly when good people participated and held bad actors accountable. It reminded me that individual action still mattered, that one person standing up could make a difference. By August, Jim Perkins had finished building his own greenhouse, though his was smaller than mine and focused mainly on herbs and flowers that Martha wanted for cooking and arrangements. He had learned from my experience and documented everything meticulously, getting all his permits in order before starting construction. The HOA board approved his plans without any issues, and his installation went smoothly. Jim thanked me multiple times for blazing the trail and showing him what was possible. I told him that was exactly how communities should work. People sharing knowledge, supporting each other, and making the neighborhood better for everyone. That was what an HOA should facilitate, not prevent. Looking back on the entire experience, I realized that the greenhouse heater had been worth far more than the $4,000 I paid for it. It had taught me about standing firm on principle. It had shown me the importance of following proper procedures and keeping detailed records. It had reminded me that most conflicts can be resolved by appealing to facts and regulations rather than emotions and power plays. And it had demonstrated that accountability matters, even in something as seemingly minor as a homeowners association. Susan Hartwell had tried to use her position to bully me into compliance with her personal preferences rather than actual rules. She had failed because I refused to be bullied, and because I had done everything correctly from the start. If I had cut corners, not gotten proper permits, or installed the heater incorrectly, she would have had legitimate grounds for enforcement. But I hadn't, and so her false accusations had backfired spectacularly. The citation from the county, the removal from the HOA board, and ultimately the criminal charges had all stemmed from her decision to file false reports. If she had simply accepted that my installation was legal and moved on, none of the negative consequences would have happened to her. Instead, she had doubled down, escalated, and ultimately paid the price. It was a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked authority and the importance of truth. It was also a reminder that documentation and proper procedure matter enormously in disputes. I had won not because I had been louder or more aggressive, but because I had been right and could prove it. As fall approached, and the intense summer heat finally began to moderate, I prepared the greenhouse for another winter growing season. I cleaned the heater thoroughly, checked all the ventilation systems, and tested the thermostat controls. Everything worked perfectly, just as it had the previous winter. The tomatoes I planted in September would be producing fruit by Thanksgiving, and I planned to have fresh salads for Christmas dinner using lettuce and herbs from the greenhouse. One afternoon in October, David Kimball stopped by to tell me that the HOA was working on a community garden project. The board had acquired a small parcel of land near the community center and wanted to build raised beds where residents could grow vegetables. "We were hoping you might be willing to serve as an advisor," David said. "You've got expertise we could really use, and people trust you after everything that happened last year." I agreed to help, and over the following months, I worked with a committee to design and build the community garden. It included 20 raised beds, a small tool shed, a communal composting area, and even a modest greenhouse for starting seedlings. It became a popular gathering place where neighbors could work side by side, share gardening tips, and build community connections. The community garden project symbolized everything the HOA should be about: bringing people together, facilitating positive activities, and enhancing property values through genuine improvements rather than restrictive enforcement. It was the polar opposite of Susan's approach, and it worked beautifully. By the time the first anniversary of the heater controversy rolled around in January, it felt like ancient history. So much had changed in the neighborhood, almost all of it for the better. The HOA operated more transparently and fairly. Community participation had increased significantly. Property values in Rolling Hills estates had actually risen faster than nearby subdivisions, partly because word had spread that it was a pleasant place to live with reasonable HOA management. I never regretted installing the greenhouse heater or fighting Susan's attempts to force me to remove it. The whole experience had taught me valuable lessons and ultimately made the neighborhood better for everyone. My plants thrived through another winter, and I continued to enjoy fresh, homegrown produce year-round. The heater itself just kept working, asking nothing more than occasional maintenance and a steady supply of propane. It was a tool, a piece of equipment designed to do a specific job, and it did that job perfectly. The fact that it had become the center of a major conflict seemed almost absurd in retrospect. But sometimes the most important principles are tested in seemingly small battles. Susan Hartwell's attempts to abuse her authority had failed because one person decided to stand up and say no, backed by documentation and proper procedures. That simple act of resistance had cascading positive effects throughout the community. It reminded everyone that rules exist to serve people, not to give petty tyrants power over their neighbors. It showed that the system can work when citizens participate and demand accountability. As I sat in my greenhouse on a cool January evening, watching my plants grow under the warm air circulated by the heater, I felt a deep sense of contentment. This was exactly what I had envisioned when I retired: a peaceful life, pursuing hobbies I enjoyed, in a community where people treated each other with respect and fairness. The conflict with Susan had threatened that vision, but standing firm had protected it. The tomatoes were setting fruit again, the lettuce was crisp and perfect, and the orchids I had added throughout the year were beginning to bloom in spectacular displays of color. Everything was as it should be, and the gentle hum of the heater provided a soundtrack to the peaceful evening. It was a sound of triumph, not over Susan specifically, but over the principle that one person should have the right to tell another person what legal improvements they could make to their own property. Gina joined me in the greenhouse, as she often did in the evenings. We had created a comfortable space with the bench, some cushions, and soft lighting. It was our sanctuary, a place to relax and talk about our day or simply sit in companionable silence. "Do you ever think about how different things would be if you had just removed the heater when Susan first demanded it?" Gina asked. Sometimes, I admitted. It would have been easier in the short term, but then she would have moved on to harass someone else. And I would have known that I backed down when I was right, which would have bothered me. You did the right thing, Gina said, and look at all the positive changes that came from it. The community garden, the fairer HOA procedures, people feeling free to use their properties without fear. That's your legacy. I wouldn't have phrased it quite that dramatically, but she had a point. One person standing up to an unfair situation had created ripples that touched many lives. It was a good reminder that individual actions matter, that we shouldn't just accept injustice, even in small doses, and that following the rules and demanding others do the same can make a real difference. The heater clicked off as the greenhouse reached its target temperature. In the silence that followed, I could hear the faint sound of wind chimes from a neighbor's yard and distant traffic from Boulder Highway. It was peaceful, exactly as retirement should be, earned through years of hard work and protected by refusing to let bullies take it away. Warren Garrison, aerospace engineer turned greenhouse gardener, had faced down an HOA president who abused her power, and had won through careful documentation, proper procedures, and unwillingness to back down when he was right. It was a victory not just for me, but for everyone who believed in fairness, accountability, and the right to use their property legally without harassment. The greenhouse heater that started it all continued its quiet work, maintaining perfect temperatures for plants that would provide fresh food and beauty throughout the year. It was just a machine, but it represented something much more important, the principle that rules should be followed and applied fairly, and that citizens have both the right and the responsibility to hold their leaders accountable. As winter gave way to spring and another growing season began, I reflected on how a simple decision to install proper heating in my greenhouse had led to such dramatic changes in our community. Life has a way of testing us in unexpected ways, and the greenhouse heater had been my test. I had passed, not by being the loudest or most aggressive, but by being right and being able to prove it. That lesson, more than any tomatoes or lettuce or orchids, was the real harvest from my greenhouse. And it was a lesson I would carry with me for the rest of my life.